My guest today is Professor Berent, who is Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University. Her research seeks to unveil human nature and our intuitive understanding of it. Welcome, Iris.
Very nice to be with you, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I have a few of your papers, and I want to start with, can we get human nature right? And you say here, few questions in science are as controversial as human nature. At stake is whether our basic concepts and emotions are all learned from experience or whether some are innate. Here I demonstrate that reasoning about innateness is biased by the basic workings of the human mind. Psychological science suggests that newborns possess core concepts of object and number. Lay people, however, you say, believe that newborns are devoid of such notions, but that they can recognize emotions. So I'm one of those lay people here. So I don't have a scientific background, um, but I do some sort of computer science work, and I always believe that humans were born with some sort of operating system, where there's some basic instructions, there's a basic operating system, and in some sense, that's what you're talking about here, right? Newborns are not born with a completely devoid brain with no information in it, right? So, is that
So,
what you're talking about?
so let's actually follow that metaphor because I think that's a great place to start. So I think the rejection of human nature is really a misnomer in a way because even the most staunch empiricist would still assume that there must be something on the operating system or else it won't operate, right? So the question is really not whether there is something on the operating system, but rather what is it? What kind of information is on the operating system?
Yeah.
And the debate between the empiricist and the rationalist really is what kind of information is it? So empiricists don't really say that the slate is really blank. The slate has the capacity to remember, the capacity to learn rules or to associate attention,
Hmm.
sensory capacity. So all those things that allow you to learn must be there on the operating system. And nobody denies that. The
Hmm.
question is that all there is? So the debate is really, do you only have those what we call domain general abilities in the sense that they allow you to learn information in many domains,
Hmm.
or is there specific knowledge that is on the system? So whether it's not just the capacity to learn and to represent data structure, but specific data structures with specific contents. For
Hmm.
example, do you have an understanding of what objects are? It turns out that there is evidence that they do. So you look at newborns and you see that, so you think that a newborn infants have no idea what object is and that they
Hmm.
just see one object after another, and that's how they come to the conclusion that objects are solid, for instance, or
Hmm.
that an object doesn't move on its own. It turns out that that's not the case, that when you present newborns with impossible scenarios in which one object bumps into the other and the second object, rather than immediately moving, it kind of sits there and thinks for a second, right? Infants are demonstrably surprised. Now, saying that this is innate is always difficult because there can be learning that happens in utero, although we can talk about why I don't think this is likely. But I think you become more, I don't know that you're ever certain, but I think it becomes more plausible when you see the phylogenetic continuity of that. So you
Hmm.
see that when you look at naive newborn chicks, they
Hmm.
too show the same capacity. And this capacity is, in fact, quite continuous in phylogeny. And to me, that suggests that it's a plausible possibility that there is innate knowledge. Now,
Hmm.
the question here isn't really, is there innate knowledge, but why do you think that there isn't one? That's the question.
Yeah, so I hate to push this analogy too far, uh, Iris, but let me
Yes,
let me take a
please.
shot at this. So, So in some sense, it's a debate between process and content. What I mean is that
Yes,
suppose I institute Windows or Apple operating system, it knows where the hard drive is, it knows where the
yeah,
disk drive is, it knows basic stuff, right? But there may not be any content on that hard drive yet. And so fundamentally, it's a question of where the hard drive comes with some
exactly.
basic information, as you say, objects, how they move,
Mhm.
how do I perceive them. Um, so does the hard drive comes with some basic knowledge like that?
Well, I just showed you that I think that why there are reasons to believe it does. So you
It
do the
does. So
experiment. So you do the experiments, and you
yeah.
show that newborns know this stuff in advance of experience.
Yeah.
Now, the claim of whether it's in advance of experience is very, very difficult to establish conclusively. One way to increase your confidence that indeed it's not experience that advances this understanding is to look at other species and show that in many species, including chicks, so you know newborn chicks and where you can very easily control what they see. And in fact, there are experiments in which they're raised in impossible conditions and they still show similar understanding. So those really, to me, present pretty plausible evidence that indeed this knowledge is innate. Or
Yeah.
else, I mean, how do you explain the continuity of that across such different species?
So is it an individual's operating system or it's a societal operating
No,
system?
no,
What I mean is that,
it,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
so you have two arms. Is that an individual or is that a societal? No, it's human nature, right? It's part
Mm.
of your genome. So because you have a human genome, then you have two arms. The claim is because you have a human genome, you also know that objects are cohesive. It comes from the same reason.
Mm. And so back in your paper, you say, moreover, people presume that concepts are learned, whereas emotions,
Mhm.
along with sensations and actions, are innate. Um, it felt a little bit counterintuitive. So, I mean, emotions and along with sensations, these are complex constructs. So, if they are in part of the operating system,
Mhm.
then it is actually it's come with a lot of data already in some sense, right? So, am I thinking about it correctly?
So are you worried that there aren't enough genes or something?
No. So, if emotions and sensations are innate, so I mean, people presume
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
but they say concepts. So concepts, maybe some physics concepts or some chemistry concepts or something like that, are learned. But emotions and sensations are complex constructs. I mean, if they are innate, the system already has a lot of capacity, a lot of data on it. That's the way I'm perceiving it.
So, so the question of whether what I'm stating are biases that concern what we believe. So people believe that knowledge is not innate, and people believe that emotions are innate. Whether or not, in fact, emotions are whether in fact those beliefs are correct or not, it's a separate question, right? So if you ask me, is there evidence that emotions are in fact innate? Well, we're going to have a different conversations about that, and I think this is a very controversial notion. My colleague Lisa Tolman Barrett believes that no, I do not completely agree, but I think this is an empirical question that you can address exactly in the same way that you can ask whether you have an understanding of object that is innate.
Hmm.
Um, Still, my point is so the main point is not what is or isn't innate, but rather what we believe that is innate.
Hmm.
And the only reason why it might be relevant to ask what is innate and what isn't innate is to show that our intuitions oftentimes are wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, see, you say also here essentialism, and we need to define that. Essentialism guides tacit reasoning
Mhm,
about biological inheritance and suggests that innate traits reside in the body.
mhm,
And per intuitive dualism, however, mind seems ethereal and innate traits reside in the body. Per intuitive dualism, however, the mind, sorry, so it thus follows that in our intuitive psychology, concepts which people falsely consider as disembodied must be learned, whereas emotions, sensations, and emotions which are considered embodied are likely innate. So let's get some definition. So there are two different concepts here, right? So one is essentialism,
mhm,
and other is intuitive dualism. So
mhm.
how do you differentiate between the two?
Very different. So essentialism is your intuition about what makes a living thing what it is. So what makes you as a person who you are, or what makes a dog what it is. And when you ask young kids, and these are not necessarily correct intuitions. This is the intuition that we have. This is our own biases. And they lead us into lots of problems. For instance, when it comes to evolution, they obviously aren't adequate. And yet they give us an approximation because even young kids believe that a dog is what it is. It's brown like its mother because they believe it was born with some tiny piece of matter that is in its body. So you believe that what makes you who you are is something that is hidden in your body. Okay, so that's the assumption. The problem is that when you come to reason about who you are, you see yourself not only as body that is physical, but also as mind that is something else that is not physical. Why? Because people believe that there is an afterlife and believe that the mind is not kind of in the body, that you believe in ghosts. So no matter, how scientific I am, if I see my, curtains moving at night, I get startled, right? I don't like it.
Yeah.
So those intuitions are just very strong that there is something that is not bodily. Here is the problem with respect to with respect to the origins of knowledge, right? So you assume that what's innate is in the body, but you think that concepts are this ethereal thing that is in the mind. So if to be innate, you must be in the body. And if concepts ain't there, then concepts can be innate per our intuition. And that's how you come to this intuition that a concept and what you know cannot be innate.
So do you think scientists are essentialists?
Yes. I
They're
mean,
typically
I
essential.
think so. I think it's worse. I think that scientists and physicians are dualists, and that's why we have. So why is there a difference between neurology and psychiatry, for instance? It's the same brain, right? So scientists are scientists and probably physicians. It's all in us. So as we educate ourselves, we try to overcome the bias and to do better. But I think that the bias is probably there.
Yeah, so I grew up in India, and it's very difficult to be an essentialist um, in a culture that is fundamentally driven by religion. And religion gives you a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts that all appears to point to some sort of dualism.
Mhm.
I mean, I haven't really thought about it, but I don't think I'll find anybody who's religious who says who believes in essentialism. Am I understanding this correctly?
I don't see. So, uh, how do you know that people are not essentialist? Why do you think this is not possible?
So dualism for me is sort of making a distinction between the body and the mind. Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
And so most religions, afterlife and all that stuff requires you to make a distinction between, sort of the body going away and the mind sort of escaping to heaven or, wherever it is. Um, so dualism, so religion almost requires to be a dualist, doesn't it?
If I would look at the chicken and egg in the other way around. I think that Because you are dualist, you're religion. So religion
Okay.
is the outcome of our intuitions that minds and body is separate. This is how we come to this, fantastic idea that there are, there are, entities that are agentive and have no body. Where would this come from? So I would think that religion is very likely a natural consequence of being an intuitive dualist.
Right. So, from an education perspective, so you are at Northeastern, you are teaching kids, you're giving them scientific information. What percentage of those kids are growing up as dualists as opposed to essentialists?
I don't see any, why not have both?
Okay.
So,
Uh,
look, if this hypothesis is correct, then these two forces form part of our human nature. It is possible that there are individual differences in their strengths, just as there are individual differences in our eyesight and so forth. But I see no reason to assume that they do not exist generally across people. It's an empirical question. You can go to the lab and ask, are people essentialists in India? But let me give you some sense about why, notwithstanding our religionist intuitions, I think that people are still essentialist. So when you go and look at different religions, even if you look at belief about afterlife, right, that there are certain entities that can persist in the afterlife, and yet in many religions, if you want to have a person persist in the afterlife, then sometimes you think they need to persist in some kind of, in a stone or in a certain type of bird or in a
yeah.
certain type, and people believe, so where is this coming from? Why? And if you're only mind, why do you need a vessel, right? And
Yeah.
this makes sense if you think of the essence of the person, that's something that is physical, and therefore it needs to stick to some physical vessel. So I think that those very religious intuitions actually do point to some essentialist thinking, although whether
Yeah.
this is the correct explanation of that needs to be looked at. I'm just saying that I don't see any tension. The more I look at religion, the more I convinced I am that these two forces of dualism and essentialism are very much active.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in some sense, a kind of a pure essentialist might believe that essentialism, so to speak, could be transferred into another entity, and that then you can sort of. So this is part of the some of the Indian religions really do get into this.
Mm-hmm.
You come back as an animal, you come back as a bird,
Mm-hmm.
and that type of stuff, right? So what you're saying is that these are not contradicting ideas. These are, in some sense, complementary, or maybe even sort of related ideas. And the issue might be that the way that you are analyzing it or you're thinking about it, perhaps.
So yes and no. You can have the human mind oftentimes holds conflicting ideas. This is human nature. So if you think about what kind of computational system our brain runs, I think that we have reasons to look at that as a soft valuable constraints rather than those invaluable rules. So if you're a dualist and you're essentialist, you're in trouble, right? Because these things are conflicting. The essence is in the body, and on the other hand, you think of yourself as mind. So how do you reconcile those things? Life is tough. So, but I don't think it's a problem of a theory. I think that this is just an accurate description of how human brain works. And you see it in other domains, such as completely different domains, such as, how the grammar works in language. And I'm not talking grammar in the sense of, somebody is telling you how to speak, but how our brain does language, what computational system is there. And I think we have very good reason to think about it as a system of self-constraints. I think of dualism and essentialism in the same way. Those things are in conflict. And I think
Yeah.
that you sense that, and it's very true. But there is nothing, it's not a problem of the system. It's a feature of the human brain.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a concept of physicalist, so I'm an atheist, and I would characterize me as a physicalist, meaning a human is a system, it's a computer system. We haven't quite figured it out. All this artificial intelligence things going on has it's nowhere close to figuring out how the human brain works, but it's fundamentally a computational system. And hence we can cook up things, we can cook up a lot of interesting ideas. But I would characterize myself as a physicalist. Is this such a concept?
Oh yeah, and I would characterize myself as a in my professional life, I very much try to be a responsible physicalist, except for, as I told you, when something is scary at night, I get scared. And I don't know about you, maybe you do too. You are. So
Yeah,
I
I
think,
do get scared. I can't go out at night by myself. I mean, clearly, yeah.
yeah, and it's not just because you think somebody is going to attack you. People do have these intuitions about supernatural beings, and it's part of this, system of conflicting constraints that we have. So, in fact, in the lab, I should tell you about that. So,
Yeah.
um, we wanted to see whether what happens for people who state that they really believe that you are the same as your body, and when you die, it's all gone, and that's it.
Yeah.
We asked people to give us these beliefs explicitly, and we took those people who say that's it, when you die, that's it, and then we gave them an implicit task. So we gave them a task that simply asked them to associate words with either mind or body, but also with adjectives such as solid versus airy.
Mm.
If you're a physicalist, then you would think about mind and body as one. But it turns out that that was not the case, and even those people who confess to be pure physicalist and, in fact, instinctivist, meaning that when you're done, you're dead, then that's it. They still behaved as dualists under the hood, which means that they thought they associated mind with airy more than with solidity, but they associated body with solidity more than airy. And this is a task that is usually it's the kind of task that is used to diagnose implicit tacit processing. And that, to me, that suggests that under the hood, we are all dualists, even though we say we're not.
Yeah, yeah. In economics, we call it hedging.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't quite know, you sort of hedge, you know. Um, and so, in some sense, we look at the 8 billion people. Do you have a sense of where they fall in the spectrum?
So I don't think that it's because you're hedge. I don't think that it's because this is a rational choice that you're making. I think that this happens by design. I
Yeah.
think it happened by design. Partly, I think that this is happening by design is because we're not all the same with respect to our intuitions about minds and bodies. And let me explain how this differs. So this is not my idea. This is an idea of Paul Bloom, who is a great psychologist, who said, like, really over 20 years ago, he wrote this wonderful book that's called Descartes' Baby, where he was the one who really popularized the idea that we are all intuitive dualists. So, of course, we're not talking about philosophy, right? This is not a philosophical commitment, but rather that intuitively, even young children believe that minds and bodies are separate.
Mm.
He suggested very briefly, but he outlined this really great idea about why we're dualists. And the story is the following. We are dualists because we are born with two conflicting core systems. So on our hardware, there
Mm.
aren't tons of things, but there are two systems for which we have very good evidence. One is our understanding of objects. And there's very good evidence, as I mentioned, that we innately understand objects as physical things that obey the laws of natural, our intuitive understanding of physics.
Yeah.
But we also look at, we believe that when we try to think about people, we predict their actions based on totally different principles. So we think that what makes, if you think about why I'm moving my hand is because maybe I'm trying to show you something. So you think about what are my motives, what are my beliefs, what are my mental states. In those mental states, you have no idea where they are in the body, right? In fact, your intuitive physics tell you that if I'm going to reach for this battle right here, intuitive physics require that there must be a force that impels my arm to move, but you don't see anything. I mean, what is the thing that makes my arm move? So for the physical system, this is going to be a problem. So let me to clarify that the physics tell you that the arm can only move by force, by physical principle. Your mind reading ability tells you that no, there are all those mental states that cause you to move and you don't see them and they're not physical. So that's basically how you become a dualist. You become a dualist because you have these two different causal principles that make you interpret reality. And one set of principles, the physical one applies to object and the other applies to agents or to people. That's a wonderful explanation, but it was completely speculative. So how do you know if this is right? And a few years back, my lab decided, so let's look at that. So by this theory, if it's really the conflict between these two systems, if one of the system is disabled, then there should be less conflict. You should be less dualist. And in particular, we know that in people who on the autism spectrum disorder.
That's one of your papers. I was going there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what we predicted is that people who are autistic are therefore going to show a weaker separation of mind and body. And that's exactly what we found. We further found that the magnitude of the separation depended on them or correlated with the mind reading abilities. And in another study, we looked at males and females. So it turns out that there's huge individual differences there, but we know that overall, on average, males are weaker mind readers than females, or so their spouses usually argue, right? What we found is, so we again predicted that males should show weaker dualism, and again, that's what was found, and the magnitude of dualism correlated with their mind reading abilities. This is not causation, so we don't know for sure that it's mind reading that caused dualism to emerge. But I think that, it's an interesting coincidence, right? So
it's an interesting coincidence. It's very interesting. It's also a very important skill that some people have. As you say, females maybe more than males. So this autism spectrum, so you say here autism attenuates the perception of the mind-body divide. I found this very interesting, Iris. So you say here people are intuitive dualists. They tacitly consider the mind as ethereal, distinct from the body. Here we ask whether dualism emerges naturally from the conflicting core principles that guide reasoning about objects on the one hand and about the minds of agents, theory of mind, TOM, on the other. To address this question, we explore dualist reasoning in autism spectrum disorder, ASD, a congenital disorder known to compromise theory of mind. So I didn't quite know this, So we all know what autism spectrum disorder is. But you're saying here is that the people with ASD has a different way of thinking about things, right? Is that what you're saying?
They have different ways of thinking about things. Tell me what you want me to talk about.
Yeah. So why is the theory of mind different in the ASD scenario? Not the theory itself, but are they processing information differently in some ways?
Yes. So theory of mind is a very unfortunate technical term. It has nothing to do with theory. I think a better term to use it for lay people is mind reading. So people who are autistic have social difficulties. That's kind of a defining attribute of being on the spectrum. People with, on the spectrum have social troubles. Why? Because to be socially active and to understand the social world around you, you need to understand that what makes people tick is what they believe, what they think. There's mental states that you have no way to predict by physical principles. You just have these intuitions that allow you to do so. So it's a well-known fact that in people with autism, mind reading is problematic. This is seen when, this was seen many years ago when Baron Cohen and Leslie I think it was the early 90s or even 80s, asked kids with autism, they gave them a false belief task. So, if I'm going to put my cell phone and you see that I'm putting my cell phone on my battle, but then I leave the room and somebody sneaks it and put it somewhere else. When I come into the room, where would I expect the cell to be? And you would think, well, where I left it. But a person with autism would think, no, they would fail to distinguish what they know from what I know. And this is an example that makes life difficult, right? Because you to predict how a person would behave, you need to understand that what they believe is critical. So there is a very large literature that shows that people with autism have troubles with mind reading. And we know what the brain mechanisms that are behind that. And we saw that there is an impairment there. It affects even moral reasoning, because moral reasoning also, you take people's intention into account when you reason about it. So it's a very well-documented problem.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. So, coupling this with the male female differentiation that we discussed before, you take care of dualism arises from theory of mind, then ASTO to attenuate dualism and promote physicalism. This makes a lot of sense to me, actually. So, I would imagine a lot of, sort of technically trained people like myself, engineers, doctors, they tend to be more physicalist.
Yes.
And in engineering, it's not a problem. In medicine, it's a little bit of a problem because you have to actually read the patient's mind, to have the right therapy. So it's sort of interesting, right? In professional settings, um, how does it help us train professionals better potentially?
You can learn theory of mind skills. So there are lots of great programs that take people who are on the autism spectrum and teach them, you can bootstrap the same ability using other mechanisms. So the brain systems that you're going to use are going to be different. You're going to use your excellent reasoning ability to try to, so you get a set of, routines or heuristics about when a person would think certain things, and you can just learn it like you learn any other, skill. And with that, you can do pretty well.
It has a downside, doesn't it? I'm just making this up, Iris. I don't know much about this. It has a downside in the sense that, suppose I'm very tuned to reading the other person's mind. Um, I might, I'm just making this up. I don't know if there's any data on this. I might be less creative in the sense that I'm almost always tactically reacting to the person that I'm talking to, right? So, what's important to me is to really understand that person and connect with that person. But in some sense, in scientific world, it may not be that useful. I mean, it might be very useful for salespeople, for instance, right? Yeah.
It gets you into tons of trouble in science.
Yeah.
There are tons of places where we know, especially look at how people reason about the brain. So look at, these days, it was more like in the early 90s, the 2000s, when brain imaging started coming out, and all the newspaper was, wow, if you learn how to read, your brain changes. I mean, what else would you expect? Where else will the change be? And yet, people are startled to find that you can actually change the brain.
Mm.
So this thinking about the brain is separate from, I mean, from the mind is very, very problematic to reasoning, to how scientists and others interpret information about the brain. It has a huge problem when it comes to mental disorders, for instance.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of stigma. I don't know if you want to go into that. I
Oh,
mean,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
so you know, in the early 2000s, the Surgeon General said, "Look at all the stigma against people with psychiatric disorders. Let's do
Mm.
something about it. Let's tell the public, you know what? Depression is exactly the same as any other disease. It's a brain disorder. That's it."
Yeah.
You think it helped? It didn't. Well, it actually had mixed effects. So in one sense, the public understood that, well, maybe the person, it's less their fault, you know, that they have these symptoms. But when you look at the literature, there's also an increase in stigma, which you would not understand.
Mm.
And again, it's kind of the coming from dualism, from the sense that if you think, um, so in my lab, we in fact ran experiments that show that we gave people two patients and you tell that one of them has, let's diagnose the depression of this person, and you either diagnose it by some brain measure or you diagnose it by some behavioral measure, and the two measures give you exactly the same information.
Mm.
And yet people believe that if you see it in the brain, they assume that it's more likely to be in it, their sister is more likely to have it, and therefore I'm not going to marry his sister, and I'm not going to hire her as a babysitter. And it's so the
They're
fact
assuming it's
that
genetic.
so let me just finish this.
Yeah.
So the fact that you assume that mind and brain are different gives you different information.
Mm.
And because you're also an essentialist and you think that if it's in the brain, it's in your body, and therefore it's born and it's never going to change, that leads to all this sense, okay, so your essence is different from my essence, and I don't want to therefore associate with you. And that's where it gets really nasty.
Mm. Yeah. So I didn't quite appreciate this, Iris. So people are saying if it is sort of in that way, it is genetic in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
it is in the it's not just in the body, it's in the family, so to speak. So you talked about marriages
Mm-hmm.
and how one might internalize the information to say, hey, there is an issue here that is transferable, transmittable
Mm-hmm.
to future generations. Is that the way that they're thinking about it?
Yeah, but it's completely fake. I mean, it's completely wrong. The fact that you see something in the brain says absolutely nothing about whether it's genetic or not genetic. So when you learn how to read, your brain is going to change. Have you been born knowing how to read? Absolutely not, right? This is only a learned skill. But everything that you learn changes your brain. So, and yet, when lay people see a change in the brain, they assume that, oh, there must be something innate and genetic about that. And that's absolutely false. There's absolutely no scientific basis for that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a problem culturally, right?
Yes.
And it's a problem therapeutically, even. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a problem that they believe comes from these intuitive biases, from dualism and essentialism that could very well be in our nature. So I think that's a huge, you know, obstacle to deal with.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, Iris. So um, it's very difficult to say. I mean, there are competing hypotheses um, on one axis in terms of essentialism and dualism. On the y-axis, you have how people internalize these concepts. That also differs quite a bit. How people think about them. As I mentioned, I'm a physicalist, but I'm always open to other ideas
Come to
because
my lab
I'm
and
not going.
come to my lab and we will see what you are under the hood.
And so it's sort of a societal cultural question, and as you say, it has therapeutic effects. How
I
doctors think
disagree.
about it. Yeah, go ahead.
I
Yeah,
disagree. I think the consequences are societal and cultural.
yeah.
The causes are probably entirely natural. So I think that what makes you, I mean, given the evidence that we have, we don't know for sure, but I think we have very good clues that suggest that dualism and essentialism and all the bad biases that they create are in our nature. They arise from those core knowledge systems that we can trace to very early in development, and we see them across cultures, and we see them in cultures where there is no basis to have these beliefs. So I mean, I think that it's fair to say that there are lots of things that we don't know for sure and needs to be, we need further evidence for them. But I see no reason to assume that these are cultural biases.
Yeah, that's really
On
interesting.
the contrary, I think that
Yeah,
the cultures that we have are shaped by these biases.
yeah, right. So I wondered if you have any data on, suppose I grew up in a very sort of academic family.
Mhm.
I'm speculating here. I would probably grow up as an essentialist or a physicalist. If I grew up in a more religious, holistic, quote unquote, human family, I might have different notions about it. So, do we have any data on how people sort of gravitate toward these notions? Is that part of their background, their parents, their
So
families, or whatever?
So the evidence that we discuss with autistic and people and male versus female suggest point the finger at these two core systems that we know are innate. At least in autism, we know that the problem with mind reading is congenital. This is not something that you learn. This is, and we know a little bit about the genetics of that as well.
Yeah.
So, if anything, the finger points into a nativist explanation there. This is not sufficient evidence, I agree, and you need to look at other explanations. So there are studies that look at dualism across cultures, and we do know. So there's one really interesting study by Chudek and colleagues who went to a particular South Pacific culture in which it's not okay to talk about the minds of others. So you don't just speculate about what other people believe and think. You just act by what are they doing, how they're acting, and everything else you don't discuss. So you would think that if you don't discuss, if children are not exposed to discussions about the minds of others, they will have very limited opportunities to assume about dualism.
Yeah.
It turns out those kids are just as dualist as everybody else. And their dualism was, and they were looking at dualism in a really interesting way. They had a nonverbal task, so they didn't ask them to say anything. It was a task in which you basically see a creature trying to reach something across a river, and then another creature, so that creature kind of, it's an animated cartoon, and the eyes kind of turn off, and then another creature kind of comes into life and gets into where the first creature is trying to get to a cake on the other side of the river, and then another creature kind of turns into life and gets to the cake, and then ask, what do you call that other creature? And what the kids say, the same name as the first creature. So they, in other words, tell you that they switch bodies, and I think that's super interesting.
Very interesting. So I want to finish up with your last paper. Consciousness has a psychology problem, you say here.
Yeah.
We could talk about this for hours,
Yes.
so, but we have a few minutes left. So the puzzle of consciousness, you say, seems to be giving science a run for its money. The problem, to be clear, isn't merely to pinpoint where it all happens in the brain, although this too is far from trivial. The real mystery is how to bridge the gap between the mental first person stuff of consciousness and the physical lump of matter inside the cranium. Yeah, so yeah, I always wondered about this. So I have a very physicalist view of consciousness, and I'll tell you what it is, and you can object to it.
I'm
I think
fine. I'm
consciousness,
physicalist. Yes.
I think consciousness is an error in the sense that when you get 80 billion neurons up there, and they're talking to each other and doing all sorts of stuff, something emerges that we sort of think as consciousness, but there's nothing physical about it. There's nothing really great about it, I would say. Actually, so I think humans, let me make a statement and I'll let you react to it. I think consciousness is very painful. So Homo sapiens, when they got to the stage, they think consciousness is a great thing, but consciousness actually gives you a lot of pain, a lot of disutility, as economists say. And so, if humans without consciousness would have been a lot better, better off. So, what do you think about that? Yeah.
I think consciousness is fun. I think that consciousness, the philosopher Humphrey says that consciousness might really make us, that explain the joy of living. I mean, it makes you feel, you look inside and you think, wow, I have all this internal life. And if I have this internal life and I have mind readings, then I think that maybe you have all this internal life and I want to know what you think. So we better be friends and let's form societies and let's cooperate. Consciousness can be something that makes our life worth living. We think that this is such a, drama that's happening inside and we want to protect it. That I think all the contrary. I think it's quite adaptive.
So, do you think animals have consciousness? Dogs and cats, I'm thinking.
So this has been, I'm not really a consciousness expert per se. There is really interesting literature that has been happening in the last years. And philosophers, the way they approached the problem, they said, we have no reason to assume that they don't have consciousness, and the consciousness is probably a continuum. And given the evidence that we have, I mean, I don't know that you have consciousness, right? In strictly speaking, there's no way to tell that some other person has consciousness. But barring that objection, there are very good reasons to think that other creatures have various aspects of consciousness, even though, I mean, consciousness can be a continuum, right? From being able to have this sense of, I look at the red on the screen and I feel this redness. I can feel pain if I pinch my finger, or I can feel that I feel, right? I can go and have the feel, oh, I'm having this experience right now. Not all creatures must have all the entire continuum. But certainly aspects of those continuum, I think that there's pretty good evidence that they could very well exist in other animals.
Yeah, so I was trying to see if it's a step function change, or rather sort of a continuous function. So, from bacteria to amoeba to Homo sapiens, have we been sort of continually moving up the consciousness curve, or something dramatic happened somewhere in African savannah that made you conscious?
I don't know. I think it's a really interesting empirical question. I think that language could very well play a role in our in the degree of consciousness that we have, especially this recursive ability to look within. Good questions for research. This is not what I do for a living.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So do you have any concluding thoughts? So your research is really interesting, Iris. So this idea of dualism versus essentialism.
But maybe let me, if I may, just link
Yeah.
it in one more way. Dualism, concern with dualism have nonetheless, so I don't know what consciousness is, right? Nobody, but there are philosophers who made very strong arguments about why consciousness is not physical.
Yeah.
And when you look at those arguments in light of what we understand about intuitions, that the mind is separate from the body and consciousness is, after all, a mental state.
Yeah.
You're wondering, is it really because consciousness is really separate from the body, or is it that just we believe it is? And while I can't tell you what consciousness really is, I can tell you that our intuitions about it are very much shaped by dualism and essentialism. And
Mm.
that was my little contribution to this debate by just pointing out, hey, look, those two little guys are actually completely messing up with all your arguments about consciousness.
Yeah.
What consciousness is, I don't know. But given that those two criminals are kind of at play, you better be very careful before you make any conclusions there.
Yeah, so from a physicalist perspective, I would argue this is what's going on in artificial intelligence. So if you pile up enough silicon, enough nodes on a neural net, a
Mhm.
physicalist would argue at some point in the future, if you have enough electricity, I don't think we have enough electricity yet, so we have to get fusion to
Quantum
make this happen.
computing, I don't know.
At some point, out of that silicon mound in Silicon Valley will emerge consciousness, and that's what a lot of people in California is hoping for. I'm definitely not hoping for that. Uh, and so it could be a physical thing, which is a measure of complexity. So you just have to get to a level of complexity, maybe two orders of magnitude higher than what we currently have, and then consciousness becomes an innate property of that complex system.
Yes, I think that the big question there is consciousness computational property, or is it in some way linked to a certain hardware? So is there something about organic human and non-human brains that allow consciousness to emerge? I think, we just don't know the answer to that. I think that those who are non-physicalists, those who think that consciousness are not property of the physical world, would tell you, actually make the argument about why there is consciousness everywhere and not only in organic entities.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Excellent. Excellent, Grace. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Very good questions. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are off.
Okay, excellent.
Excellent.
So,
Yeah,
can you send me a link when you post it, please?
I will. Yeah,
And
definitely.
who's your audience? I'm curious.
They'll be typically academics and graduate students. It's sort of niche in the sense that we don't have a broad,
Mhm.
millions of people listening to it, but I think we have about, I would say about 200,000 people
That's very
listening to it.
nice. Where are they? In the US, in
All around
India?
the world. So we have
Wow.
people from 150 different countries. Yeah.
Wow. How did you manage to build this audience?
Sorry.
How did you build this audience?
Oh, so I've been doing this for about 4 years now.
Mhm.
So I started with COVID. Yeah,
Mhm.
I couldn't travel anywhere, so I thought I'll do something more interesting.
Mhm.
And we did about 470
Wow.
episodes so far. So yeah,
And what is your own training? Yeah, in computer science, I understand, but in what specific?
uh, I have a very checkered history. So I was an engineer before,
Uh-huh.
and then I became an economist. I was at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company,
Uh-huh.
for a while, and started my own company, which is sort of an AI company. And I am close to retirement now, so I can make more of these episodes.
Well, good
And
for you for doing that. I really admire the curiosity and going into so many areas. This is wonderful. This really makes, academics do their own thing and tend to be in there. And it's so nice to see people who are voracious, interested in. So good for you. Keep up the good work.
thank you. Yeah, thanks for spending time with me.
Of course.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
know.